This lecture video is on adjustment policies that an open economy might adopt in order to achieve full employment with price stability and equilibrium in the balance of payments. An open economy might experience some automatic adjustment mechanism that will automatically correct any balance of payment disequilibrium. But the problem with such automatic adjustment mechanism is that they have serious undesirable side effects. Because of these undesirable side effects, noted economists such as Mead have often pointed towards the necessity for government intervention and the necessity for a shift towards the adjustment policies. An open economy seeks to pursue different economic goals or objectives. The first one is the attainment of internal balance. Internal balance is nothing but maintaining the full employment, but that does not necessarily mean that the rate of unemployment which will be exactly 0%. So the rate of unemployment usually is not more than 2 to 3% per year. This is often called the frictional unemployment. This type of unemployment is voluntary in nature. So if one person leaves a certain job and seeks some other job, then this searching period is often referred to as the period of frictional unemployment. Moreover, in attaining the internal balance, the nation need not bring its rate of inflation to 0%. Rather, a rate of moderate inflation of no more than 2 to 3% per year may be tolerated by the open economy. The second most important objective of an open economy is to maintain equilibrium in the balance of payment. Once again, the nation need not have equilibrium in the balance of payment exactly, but rather it can have surplus, which is a desirable disequilibrium. But often that might lead to appreciation, particularly in the flexible exchange rate system of the domestic currency, so that surplus may not always be desirable. Moreover, a deficit in the balance of payment will be creating some other problems. Therefore, the economy will try to maintain the external balance. In general, the nations prefer to attain the internal balance first, so that the internal balance is basically a priority of the nation over the external balance. But often, due to some external reasons or some external factors, the countries are forced to switch their priority. The third type of objective or goal that an open economy often tries to pursue is maintaining a reasonable rate of growth. And fourthly, there should be an equitable distribution of income. But in our analysis, we shall try to find out the different policy instruments which will help the nation to attain internal and external balance simultaneously. Now, to achieve these objectives, the nations have three types of policy instruments at their disposal: the expenditure changing or the demand policies, the expenditure switching policies, or the direct controls. The expenditure changing policies or the demand policies are basically the monetary and the fiscal policies. So they may be expansionary or contractionary, and if it is monetary policy, then it may be easy or tight monetary policy. In the fiscal policies, we have changes in the taxes, changes in the government expenditures. Now, the contractionary fiscal policy will be reducing the government expenditure or the increase in the taxes, so that the domestic production and income will fall, and ultimately the imports will fall. On the other hand, the expansionary fiscal policy will be taking place when the government increases its government expenditure or reduces the taxes. In that case, the expenditure will increase in the economy, so that will increase the domestic production and income, and ultimately that will lead to an increase in the import. Now, monetary policy, as I have mentioned earlier, it may be easy or it may be tight. If the monetary policy is easy, then the money supply is increased and the interest rates will be falling. Now, as interest rate falls, then the level of investment and income will rise, because there is the multiplier, and as income rises, then imports will also rise. Now, as the interest rate is reduced, then there will be a short-term capital outflow or inflow will be reduced. Now, on the other hand, the government might adopt a tight monetary policy so that the nation's money supply is reduced. So, in that case, the interest rate will rise. This will be reducing the investment income and the resultant import. Moreover, there will be the short-term capital inflow or some sort of reduction in the capital outflows. The expenditure switching policies, on the other hand, will be operating through changes in the exchange rate through the government policy. Now, if there is a devaluation, then the domestic currency will be depreciating. If the exchange rate is defined as the domestic currency per unit of the foreign currency. Now, as there is a devaluation, then the exports will rise and the imports will fall, so that expenditure will be switching from the foreign to the domestically produced commodities. So that a devaluation will improve a nation's trade balance. But after the devaluation, the domestic production will also rise, so the imports will also rise. So this will partially neutralize the original improvement in the balance of trade. Alternatively, the nation can go for the revaluation of the domestic currency. So in that case, the exchange rate will fall and the exports will be discouraged and imports will be encouraged. And the results of revaluation will be just the opposite of what we have in the context of devaluation. Apart from this, there are certain direct controls. For example, the import tariff, import quota, where the government puts certain restrictions on the free flow of imports into the economy. Now, there are certain problems associated with this import tariff, import quota, or other types of direct controls, because in that cases, some other side effects will be there. For example, in the context of quota, some licensing system might generate, so there will be some undesirable side effects. Now, these direct controls are also a part of the expenditure switching policy, because they will be switching the expenditures from the foreign produced goods to the domestically produced goods. But this type of direct controls will be introduced with some specific balance of payment objectives. Given this, it is often pointed out that a nation usually needs as many effective policy instruments as the number of objectives. This view was first supported by Tinbergen, who pointed out that if a nation has two important objectives to attain, then there should be two policy instruments. Otherwise, the nation will not be able to attain the objectives properly. Moreover, there are certain cases when a particular policy will not only help attain one particular objective, but it will push the nation towards attaining the other objectives also. The reverse may also be true. For example, sometimes a policy instrument directed at a particular objective might push the nation even further away from the second objective. We can take an example for that. For example, if we take an expansionary fiscal policy, then there will be a deficit in the balance of payments. Each policy will affect both the internal and external balance of the nation. So it is therefore very important to find out that what is the optimum pairing of the different policies. So this optimum pair of policies should be used for the objective toward which it is most effective. Now this is called the principle of effective market classification, and this was developed by Mundell. So now in the next sections, we shall first of all try to find out that how the nation can attain the internal and external balance with expenditure changing and expenditure switching policies, and then we shall be moving on to the Mundell-Fleming model. Now we consider how a nation can attain the internal as well as external balance simultaneously by making use of the expenditure changing and the expenditure switching policies. Now for this we make certain assumptions. First of all, we assume that there is a zero international capital flow. Now by this assumption, what we ensure is that the balance of payment will be equal to the nation's trade balance. Moreover, we also assume that the prices will remain constant until aggregate demand begins to exceed the full employment level of output. For our analysis, we need to have two curves. One is the EE curve, which shows the external balance for the economy, and the YY curve, which shows the internal balance in the economy. Let us consider the derivation of the external balance curve or EE first. So on the horizontal axis we measure the domestic absorption, and on the vertical axis we measure the exchange rate, where exchange rate is defined as domestic currency per unit of the foreign currency. Now in this exchange rate domestic absorption plane, the EE curve will be given by the upward rising line. So each point on this line will be giving us the points of external balance. Now why is this curve upward rising? When the exchange rate rises either due to devaluation or depreciation, then there is some improvement in the balance of trade. Of course, if the Marshall-Lerner condition is satisfied. So in order to maintain the balance in the external sector, then the domestic absorption and domestic income must rise sufficiently so that imports rise sufficiently so as to neutralize that original improvement in the balance of trade. So that is why when the exchange rate rises, then the domestic absorption must rise if the economy is to attain the external balance. So that is why the EE curve is upward rising. Now we consider any point C which is lying to the right of the EE schedule. Now if we compare point B and point C, then at point B we have external balance. Now at point C the domestic absorption is D3, but for the given level of exchange rate the equilibrium domestic absorption must be D2. Since at point C, the domestic absorption is more than what it should be to maintain external balance, the imports must be higher at point C than what it should be to maintain the external balance. Therefore, since at point C imports are more than what is required, point C is a point of deficit in the external balance. Now we consider a point like A which lies to the left of the EE curve. Now we compare this point A with point B. Point B is a point where external balance is attained. Moreover, at point A and point B the exchange rates are same. But at point A the extent of domestic absorption is lower than what it is at point B. So therefore, at point A, the domestic absorption is less than what it should be to maintain the external balance. Therefore, imports at point A is less than what it should be in order to maintain the external balance. Therefore, at point A, we have a surplus in the external balance. Thus, for all points to the right of the EE curve, we have deficit in the balance of payment, and for all points to the left of the EE curve, we have surplus in the external balance. Now we consider the YY curve, which shows us the different combinations of exchange rate and domestic absorption such that the economy is at internal balance. The YY curve is negatively sloped because reduction in the exchange rate will be reducing the trade balance, and it must be matched by a larger domestic absorption for the nation to maintain the internal balance. Now we consider 2 points B and C. B is on the YY curve, therefore at point B internal balance is maintained, but C is off the YY curve and it is lying to the right of the YY curve. The exchange rate is same at point B and point C, but at point C the domestic absorption is more than what it is at point B. Therefore, at point C, the domestic absorption is more than what it should be to maintain the internal balance in the economy. Therefore, as the domestic absorption is higher, so that the demand for the goods will be higher in the economy, but the supply of the good is only that which is given by point B, so that there is an excess demand in the economy and that will be leading to an inflation. Therefore, for all points to the right of YY, we have inflation. Similarly, for all points to the left of or to the below YY curve, we have unemployment. We can compare point A with point B. Now at point A and point B, the exchange rate is same, but at point A, the domestic absorption is D1, which is less than what it could be in order to maintain the internal balance. Therefore, if the domestic absorption is less, so the demand is less, so that there will be unemployment or excess capacity in the economy. Therefore, for all points to the left of the YY curve or for all points below the YY curve, we shall be having the unemployment. Now we consider a diagram where we have both the YY and the EE curves. On the vertical axis, we have the exchange rate, and on the horizontal axis, we have domestic absorption. Now, these two curves intersect at point E. So, at point E, we have internal as well as external balances to be maintained. The equilibrium exchange rate is R star and the domestic absorption is D star. Now, from this diagram, we can identify 4 zones. In zone 1, we have balance of payment surplus or external balance surplus and unemployment. In zone 2, we have surplus and inflation. In zone 3, we have deficit and inflation, and in zone 4, we have deficit and unemployment. Therefore, only at point E, we have internal as well as external balance for the economy. Let us assume that to start with, the nation does not begin from point E. Let us further assume that it starts from a point such as C prime, which is on the EE curve. That means the country is on the external balance line, but it is not having internal balance, rather there is unemployment in the economy. Starting from point C prime, the government can adopt two different policy paths. Let us consider the first one. Suppose that starting from point C prime, the government decides to increase the exchange rate or to devalue such that it moves upward and hits the YY curve. So then it attains the internal balance, but it then loses the external balance. Since it has devalued, so its balance of trade now is in surplus, so that now it is off the EE curve. Now starting from this, now the country wants to reach the EE path. So for that it takes the expansionary fiscal policy or a suitable monetary policy so that the domestic absorption increases. Now as domestic absorption increases, then the economy hits the EE line. So now it has the external balance because of the fact that the increase in domestic absorption has increased the imports also, and that has eroded the balance of trade surplus that the economy achieved through the depreciation or devaluation. Now the government reduces the exchange rate or appreciates the currency so that the country moves downward and hits the YY curve again. So now it has internal balance and it has deficit in the balance of trade. This is obvious because the domestic currency has appreciated now, so that exports are discouraged, imports are encouraged, so that the zero external balance will now be turned into a deficit. So now from the YY line, then to reach the EE line, the government might take up a policy to reduce the domestic absorption. So either it's a contractionary fiscal policy or a suitable monetary policy, so that it hits once again the EE curve. So now once again the country is off the YY line. So it has unemployment now in the economy, but it has attained the external balance. So from this, now once again exchange rate will be depreciating, and following this black line path, the country will ultimately be reaching the equilibrium point E. Now we assume that to start with, the nation is at point J, which is a point on the YY curve, so that the country has internal balance, but point J is not on the EE curve. Therefore there is deficit in the balance of trade for the country. Now starting from point J, the country can have different types of policy. Now suppose here we are assuming that starting from point J, first the domestic absorption is reduced through appropriate monetary or fiscal policy, and the country hits the EE curve. Now since the domestic absorption is reduced, imports are reduced, so that the deficit in the balance of trade will also be reduced, and ultimately the country reaches the external balance. Now from that point, the country now increases its exchange rate so that its currency devalues. So as the currency is devalued, then there will be some surplus in the balance of trade, and the economy will be hitting once again the YY curve, because the domestic production will rise, so that the internal balance will also be maintained. Now the country increases the domestic absorption through the appropriate monetary and fiscal policy to hit once again the EE curve. So once again, as the domestic absorption increases, the imports will increase, and then the surplus in the balance of trade will be depleted. So once again the country is in balance of trade equilibrium. Starting from this point, then the country may reduce the exchange rate by suitable revaluation. Then once again YY curve will be reached, but there will be deficit in the balance of trade, just because of the fact that appreciation of the domestic currency will encourage the imports and discourage the exports. Then once again the country will reduce the domestic absorption to hit EE, then increase the exchange rate to hit YY, then increase domestic absorption and followed by revaluation. So in that way the path will be followed by the government of the country so as to ultimately reach point E. Now starting from point J, instead of reducing the domestic absorption, the country might start from increasing the exchange rate or by devaluing its currency. So in that case it will be following a different path so as to attain the point E. Now in that way we can find out different policy prescriptions when the economy starts from any other points. Now in our earlier examples we started from a case where the nation was either in internal balance or in external balance, but that should not be the case. For example, the nation may start like a point C which is in zone 4 or a point H which is in zone 4 once again, which is a zone of deficit in the external balance as well as unemployment so far as the internal balance is concerned. Now starting from a point such as C, then the country might take different policy prescriptions. For example, starting from point C, the country might first of all choose to external balance first and then to go for the internal balance. Therefore, starting from point C, the country might go for a devaluation first, an increase in exchange rate so as to hit the EE curve, and then it can increase the domestic absorption to hit YY, followed by further devaluation to hit the EE curve, then a reduction in domestic absorption to hit the YY curve once again, and then there will be a reduction in the exchange rate or appreciation of the domestic currency. In that way the country will ultimately move towards equilibrium point E. Now there is another path also. The government might decide to attain the internal balance first. In that case, starting from point C, first of all the country will be going for a suitable fiscal or monetary policy so as to increase the domestic absorption. So in that case it would hit the YY curve first, and then there should be a devaluation, exchange rate increases, it hits the EE curve, then the absorption should be raised and absorption should be decreased, followed by some appreciation in the currency, and we shall have to check whether in this process the point E may be reached or not. There are some other points in this diagram also. For example, we have point N. Now point N is lying on the line ER star, so that the point N is already having the right exchange rate R star. So now it will have to move towards point E. So in that case only one policy is sufficient. So it can increase the domestic absorption through the appropriate monetary or fiscal policy so as to attain the point E. Or alternatively, it can first of all reach point EE either through the devaluation by rising up, or it can hit the curve EE by a revaluation, thereby moving downwards. Then after that it can go for the suitable domestic absorption affecting policy so as to hit YY once again. But in that case the situation would be or the solution would be much more complicated. So here, if a country starts from a point like N, then it can use only one policy because the exchange rate is already optimal. Now, similar situation will be faced if the point is lying somewhere on the ED star line. In that case, the domestic absorption is already optimal or already is at the right point. So what the nation will have to ensure is that the exchange rate is also right. So this can be attained if the currency is devalued by the right amount. Similarly, if the economy starts from point S, then once again the exchange rate is right, but the government will have to take a suitable policy so as to reduce the domestic absorption only. If on the other hand the economy starts from point T, then D star is at optimal level, so the government now will have to revalue its currency in an appropriate amount so that it can reach the point E. So in that case we can find out how the different expenditure changing and expenditure switching policies can be combined so as to attain both the balances simultaneously. Now this diagram is called the Swan diagram by the name of its proponent. So it helps us a lot in order to find out the policy mix. But to get the efficacy of the monetary and the fiscal policies in an open economy, this model is not a very useful one. So for that we shall have to consider the Mundell-Fleming version of the Keynesian ISLM model, so that we can find out the efficiency and the efficacy of the monetary and the fiscal policies in an open economy. The open economies are engaged in trade with other countries. They are faced with balance of payment surplus and deficit, and then accordingly there are capital inflows or the capital outflows. Now in this context it is very important to maintain the internal and the external balances simultaneously. Now the Mundell-Fleming model helps us to identify the business cycle in the open economy, and it is a model which shows the effect of and the efficacy of the monetary and fiscal policies under different exchange rate regimes and under different regimes of capital mobility, the ways in which the balances may be attained simultaneously. The Mundell-Fleming model is actually the open economy version of the Keynesian ISLM framework. So it actually shows the how conflict between the internal and the external balance may be resolved in an open economy. So we may start with the Mundell-Fleming model that was introduced by Robert Mundell and M.J. Fleming. Their seminal paper were published in the International Monetary Fund Staff Papers, and accordingly, following their names, the model is treated as the Mundell-Fleming model. So now we start the model. We assume that the nominal exchange rate E is defined as home currency per unit of foreign currency. But alternatively, we can write it as foreign currency per unit of home currency. But in that case, our explanations would be a bit different. As mentioned earlier, the Mundell-Fleming model is the open economy version of the Keynesian ISLM model. Now we shall try to find out what happens to the IS curve and the LM curve in the open economy, and we shall also try to find out what are the new apparatus or the new instruments that are used in the Mundell-Fleming model in order to assess the efficacy or efficiency of the monetary and the fiscal policies. The LM curve is remaining unchanged as it was in the standard ISLM model. The LM curve shows the combinations of rate of interest and income such that the money market is in equilibrium. The equilibrium condition in the money market, or the equation for the LM curve, is given in equation 1. The left hand side shows the real money supply and the right hand side shows the real demand for money. Now, the real demand for money will be coming from two sources. One is the speculative demand for money, which is depending on the rate of interest in an inverse fashion, so that as the rate of interest rises, the speculative demand for money falls. The other component of the demand for money is the transactions demand for money, which is directly dependent on the level of income of the individual agents in the economy. Now, the government controls the nominal money supply through its monetary policy. But since the price level is assumed to be fixed in the Mundell-Fleming model, the government's effective control will be on the real money supply. The money is then endogenous in the system. The international reserves are used by the government to defend the exchange rates, and that will in turn affect the money supply. The LM curve is upward rising in the RY plane. Now, this is because as the rate of interest rises for a given level of money supply, the speculative demand for money will fall. Now, to maintain the equilibrium, the demand for money has to rise. So, an increase in income will increase the transaction demand for money and will eventually bring the money market back in equilibrium. So that is why the LM curve is upward rising. Next, we consider the IS curve, which shows the combinations of rate of interest and income such that the goods market is in equilibrium. Now, the IS curve will be changing under the Mundell-Fleming model from what it was in the standard ISLM model. Let us now consider the equation for the goods market equilibrium. So now we have the government, so that we have government expenditure and the taxes, and since it's an open economy, so that we have the exports and the imports. So we rewrite the equation for the goods market equilibrium as C plus S plus T, which is identically equal to Y, and that Y may also be written as C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Now, this consumption is actually a function of the disposable income, so that C now will be a function of Y minus T of Y, where T of Y are the taxes. Similarly, the saving function S will also be dependent on the level of disposable income, which is nothing but Y minus T of Y. Then we have the tax rate. Now, from this consumption function, we have the marginal propensity to consume to be a positive proper fraction, and the marginal propensity to save is also a positive proper fraction. The sum of marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save will be equal to 1. Now, the investments are not exogenously given in the ISLM model. So, even under the Mundell-Fleming model, investment will be a function of R, rate of interest, and it is an inverse function, so that as R rises, the level of investment will fall. G, the level of government expenditure, is exogenously given. Now, coming to the exports, we can now find out the factors on which the level of export will be determining. So, exports will determine on the level of income in the foreign country, Y star, and on the exchange rate. So, as the exchange rate rises, then the exports will also rise, and as Y star rises, then the exports will also rise. This is because as Y star rises, the foreigners' import demand will rise. Since foreigners' imports are our exports, so our exports will also rise. Now we have the import function where the imports are dependent on three things: Y, Y star and the level of exchange rate. Now exports are not a function of the level of income of the domestic country. Now as Y rises, level of domestic income, then imports will rise. As Y star rises, then foreigners' import will also rise, so that will increase our exports, our income, and eventually our imports will also rise. Similarly, a rise in the exchange rate will also have some impact on the import. So in this case, the impact will be an inverse impact, so that with an exchange rate increase, the level of import will be falling. So now we can rewrite the equation for the goods market equilibrium as Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Now this C, I and G will be treated as the domestic absorption. So this is written as A, and it will be a function of the rate of interest and the level of Y. But of course it will depend on the level of taxes also. So apart from this absorption, we have the net exports, which is nothing but export minus import. So this net export will be depending on Y, domestic income, Y star, foreign income, and the exchange rate. So this net export will be giving us the foreigners' contribution to the aggregate demand. The IS curve is negatively sloped in the RY plane because an increase in R will reduce the level of investment and eventually it will reduce the level of income. We consider the slope of the IS curve in the Mundell-Fleming model and in what way it is different from the slope of the IS curve in the standard ISLM model. Now in the closed economy, the slope of the IS curve is given as 1 minus C prime into 1 minus T prime but by I prime, where C prime is the marginal propensity to consume and I prime is the derivative of the investment function. Now if we consider the open economy equilibrium condition, then we find that the slope of the IS curve is changing a bit. So it is now becoming 1 minus C prime into 1 minus T prime plus M prime by I prime, where M prime is the marginal propensity to import, which is a positive proper fraction. Therefore, the IS curve in the open economy is steeper as the marginal propensity to import is a positive proper fraction. Now, as the interest rate falls, the investment will rise, income would also rise. But here, in the context of open economy, we have an additional leakage in the form of import. Therefore, the increase in income would be less than what it was in a closed economy. Therefore, the IS curve in the open economy will be steeper than the IS curve in the closed economy. This is evident from the figure. As the rate of interest falls from R0 to R1, then under the closed economy framework, the income will rise from Y0 to Y2, but in the context of the open economy, since there are additional leakages, so that income will rise only up to Y1. So there is a gap, and in the open economy, the country cannot reach the level of income Y2, so it has to be satisfied with the level of income Y1. In the open economy, the IS curve is shown as a relationship between R and the domestic income Y, and this curve is drawn taking exchange rate and Y star, the foreign income, as exogenous. Now, a change in this exogenously given exchange rate and Y star will be having its impact on the IS curve. Let us consider a rise in the exchange rate. So the exchange rate can rise either because of the devaluation in the fixed exchange rate regime, or it can rise because of depreciation of the home currency in the flexible exchange rate system. Now, when the exchange rate rises, then exports will rise and imports will fall, so that the NX or the trade balance will rise. This will increase the level of income for any given hour, so that the IS curve will be shifting towards rise. Now we consider a rise in Y star or the foreign country's income. Now as Y star rises, then through the export multiplier and the backwash effect, the trade balance will improve. Therefore, for any given hour, the level of income in the domestic economy will also increase, so that the IS curve will be shifting towards the right. Therefore, a decline in E or a decline in Y star will be shifting the IS curves to the left. Now we introduce the BP curve, which was not there in the standard ISLM model. The BP curve shows the combinations of R and Y such that the external balance is attained in an economy. Now this BP or the external balance is given by the sum of the current account balance and the movements in the capital account. So we write BP to be equal to TB, the trade balance, plus KA or the capital movements in and out of the economy. Therefore, this trade balance can be written as X minus M, where X depends on Y star and E, and M depends on Y star and E. The capital flows respond to the interest rate differential. So let us now introduce the two types of interest rate. R is the domestic rate of interest and R star is the foreign rate of interest. Now if R is greater than R star, then capital will be flowing into the domestic economy, and if R is less than R star, then capital will be flowing out of the domestic economy. Therefore, the capital flows will be responding to the interest rate differential. So, if R minus R star is exactly equal to 0, so that there will be no capital inflows or capital outflows. Therefore, now we can write that KA part as KA bar, which is the exogenous part, plus small k times R minus R star, where small k is a constant. So now the capital flows or the movements in the capital account will be responding to the interest rate differential. Now we try to find out the slope of the BP curve. In order to do that, we set BP to be equal to 0, and differentiating we get the slope of the BP curve to be M prime by K. Now M prime is the marginal propensity to import, which is a positive proper fraction, and K is also positive because the capital flows are responding to the interest rate differential positively. So K is positive. Therefore, M prime by K is positive and the slope of the BP curve is upward rising. If income rises, then imports will also rise. For a given level of export, there will be a deficit in the balance of payment. In order to maintain equilibrium in the external sector, then the rate of interest must be higher so that capital flows into the domestic economy. So that is why the BP schedule will be upward rising. Now, if K is equal to 0, small k is equal to 0, then the BP line would be vertical, because then the BP line will not be depending on the interest rate differential. So if the BP line is vertical, then for any different value of the rate of interest, Y will be unchanged. So higher the value of K, then the flatter will be the BP schedule. The BP schedule is also related to the marginal propensity to import. So the lower the value of the marginal propensity to import, then the flatter will be the BP schedule. The shape of the BP schedule will also depend on the extent of substitutability between the domestic and the foreign assets, and essentially it will depend on whether the capital mobility is perfect or imperfect in an economy. Now, if we suppose that the domestic and the foreign assets are perfectly substitute, then if there is any discrepancy between R and R star, then eventually through capital inflows and capital outflows the interest rates will be equalized, so that there will be a horizontal BP schedule. So the BP schedule will be upward rising only in the case of imperfect mobility and imperfect substitutability between the domestic and the foreign asset. So if the domestic and foreign assets are not perfect substitutes of one another, then in the presence of an interest rate differential, capital will be flowing in or flowing out, but R will never be equalized to R star, so that the BP schedule will be having some positive slope. We may now consider the points of the BP curve. So each point on the BP curve, such as point B, will show the combinations of R and Y such that the economy attains the external balance. Now we consider another point C. At point C, the rate of interest is R0 as it was in the context of point B, but the level of income is Y2, which is higher than Y0. Therefore, the level of income is higher than what it should be in order to attain the balance of payments equilibrium. So, the level of input will be higher at Y2, and accordingly the deficit will also be higher at point C. Therefore, for each point to the right of BP schedule, there will be a deficit in the balance of payments. Now we consider a point like point A. If we compare point A with point B, then we find that the rate of interest is unchanged at R0. But at point B, which is giving us external balance, the level of income is Y0. But at point A, which is of the BP curve, the level of income is Y1, which is less than Y0. Therefore, the imports at point A is relatively less than the import at point B. Therefore, at point A, we must have a surplus for a given level of exports. Therefore, for all points to the left of the BP schedule, we have a balance of trade surplus. Now we consider how the internal and external balances will be simultaneously attained in the context of the Mundell-Fleming model. Now in the diagram we superimpose the IS, LM and the BP schedule. Here the BP schedule is drawn flatter compared to the LM curve, but the BP schedule may be steeper also, and it will be having different implications so far as the policies are concerned. Now in this diagram, the internal and external balances are attained at point E, such that the equilibrium rate of interest is R0 and the equilibrium level of income is Y0. Now we shall be considering the effectiveness of different policies in the Mundell-Fleming model, so that we shall be taking different cases of fixed exchange rate regime and flexible exchange rate regime. We shall be discussing the efficacy of the different policies under the perfect capital mobility as well as under the imperfect capital mobility. Therefore, under the fixed exchange rate regime, we shall be having two cases, imperfect and perfect capital mobility, and under the flexible exchange rate regime also we shall be having two cases of imperfect capital mobility and the perfect capital mobility. First of all, we consider the impact of an expansionary monetary policy under the fixed exchange rate regime with imperfect capital mobility. Now, since the capital mobility is imperfect, BP schedule will be upward rising instead of being horizontal. So, now we have the IS, LM and the BP schedule in the diagram. All these three curves intersect at point E, so that we have internal as well as external balances. So the rate of interest is R0 and the level of income is Y0. Now starting from this level of equilibrium, now the government takes up an expansionary monetary policy which shifts the LM curve towards right from LM to LM1. The new equilibrium will be attained at the point where IS and the LM curve are intersecting each other, that is at point E1. The rate of interest falls from R0 to R1 and the level of income rises from Y0 to Y1. Therefore, the expansionary monetary policy is effective because it increases the domestic income. However, there is a problem. So far as the external balance is concerned, the new equilibrium point E1 is lying below the BP curve, so that at point E1 there is balance of payment deficit. So since it's a regime of fixed exchange rate, then exchange rate cannot rise automatically in response to a BOP deficit. Therefore, under imperfect capital mobility and the fixed exchange rate regime, the expansionary monetary policy can increase the level of domestic income, but the country will be facing some BOP deficit. The rate of interest R1 is below the world rate of interest, which is R0. Now we consider the effectiveness of an expansionary fiscal policy under fixed exchange rate and imperfect capital mobility. Since there is imperfect capital mobility, the BP curve is upward rising, the IS curve is downward sloping, IS 0 initially, and we have the LM curve which is, to start with, steeper than the BP curve, which is LMS. Now we shall be considering a flatter LM curve also, which is given in the diagram as LMF. So initially we assume that the IS curve is IS 0, LM is LMS, and the BP curve is given as BP. The equilibrium is attained at point E where these three curves intersect each other. The rate of interest is R0 and the level of income is Y0. Now suppose the government takes up an expansionary fiscal policy. Then the IS curve will be shifting rightwards. The new equilibrium is attained at point M where IS1 and LMS will be intersecting each other. So the rate of interest rises from R0 to R1 and the level of income will be rising from Y0 to Y1. So that now the expansionary fiscal policy is effective because it increases the level of income in the economy. However, there is another problem so far as the balance of payment is concerned. Now, point M is lying above the BP schedule, so that there is balance of payment surplus at point M. So, under the imperfect capital mobility and the fixed exchange rate, if the LM curve is steeper than the BP schedule, then after the fiscal policy expansion is adopted, then there will be a surplus in the balance of trade, and the domestic rate of interest R1 will be higher than the world rate of interest, which is R0. Now we suppose that to start with the LM curve is flatter than the BP schedule, so that it is now LMF. The original equilibrium is still at point E with R0 and Y0 as the equilibrium level of interest rate and the income. Now the expansionary fiscal policy shifts the IS curve from IS 0 to IS 1. The new equilibrium is attained at point N where IS 1 is cutting the LM curve. Now at point N, the rate of interest rises slightly to R2, but the expansion in income is much more than what it was in the earlier case when the LM curve was steeper. So now income rises to Y2, which is much greater than Y1. However, there is now a difference so far as the balance of trade is concerned. In the second case, at point N, we have a deficit because point N lies to the right of, or it lies below the BP curve. Now, since it is a fixed exchange rate regime, then the exchange rate cannot change automatically in response to balance of deficit or balance of payment surplus. So in this context, the expansionary fiscal policy is effective, no doubt, but it will be having some problems in terms of the balance of payment equilibrium. If the LM curve is steeper than the BP schedule, then there will be a surplus, and if the LM curve is flatter than the BP schedule, then there is a deficit. So in this context, the slope of the BP schedule and the LM schedule are very important. Now we consider the effectiveness of expansionary monetary policy under imperfect capital mobility but flexible exchange rate regime. So to start with, we assume that the curves are IS0, LM0 and BP0. BP curve is having some curvature because it's imperfect capital mobility. But now we have flexible exchange rate regime, so that any surplus or any deficit in the balance of payment will lead to a change in the exchange rate automatically. The initial equilibrium is attained at point E, where IS0, LM0 and BP0 curves intersect each other. The equilibrium rates are R0 and Y0. Now we suppose that the government increases the money supply so that the LM curve shifts rightwards from LM0 to LM1. Now initially the equilibrium will be attained at point N, where IS0 is cutting the LM1 curve. At point N, the rate of interest falls to R1, whereas income rises from Y0 to Y1. Now at point N, since it is lying below the BP curve, we have balance of trade deficit. Now since it's a flexible exchange rate regime, a deficit in the balance of trade will lead to a rise in the exchange rate, so that the domestic currency will automatically depreciate. Now as the exchange rate rises, then there will be impact on the BP schedule as well as on the IS schedule. Now since exchange rate increases, the IS schedule will be shifting rightwards parallelly. So now the new IS schedule will be IS1. As the exchange rate rises, then the BP schedule, which is also drawn on the basis of a given exchange rate, will also shift from BP0 to BP1. Therefore, the new equilibrium will be attained at a different point M, where IS1, LM1 and BP1 will be intersecting each other once again. So at point M, the rate of interest is R2, so it is not R1, and the income will rise further to Y2. At point M, then we have internal as well as external balance, because point M now is on the BP schedule. So the rate of interest will be given by R2, which is lower than R0 of course, but it is more than R1, and the income is Y2, which is more than Y0 as well as Y1. Therefore, under the flexible exchange rate regime, of course the rate of interest will be less than the original rate of interest, but under the fixed exchange rate regime, the interest rate would have been much lower. Whereas in the flexible exchange rate regime, the increase in the income will be much more than what it should be under the fixed exchange rate regime. Therefore, under imperfect capital mobility and the flexible exchange rate system, the monetary policy is definitely effective, because it increases the level of income, and the increase in the level of income is much more than what it could be under the fixed exchange rate regime. Now we consider the effect of the expansionary fiscal policy under imperfect capital mobility and flexible exchange rate regime. Initially, the curves are IS0, LM and BP0. They intersect at the interest income combination R0 Y0, so that is the initial equilibrium. Now we suppose that the government takes up an expansionary fiscal policy that shifts the IS curve from IS0 to IS1. The LM curve is unchanged, so that the interest rate rises to R1 and the income rises to Y1. However, at this point the balance of payment will be in surplus because this new equilibrium point is lying above the BP curve. So since this is the flexible exchange rate regime and there is surplus, so that the exchange rate will automatically fall, so that the domestic currency will appreciate. Now as the exchange rate falls, then BP curve will be shifting upward from BP0 to BP1 and the IS curve will be shifting back towards IS0. So now the new IS curve will be IS2. The new equilibrium will be attained at a point where IS2, the red line, the original LM curve and the green line BP1 are cutting them. So the rate of interest now becomes R2, so that the country cannot have the rate of interest to be R1 anymore, and the level of income will also fall to Y2, so that the country can no longer attain the level of income Y1. So the new equilibrium is characterized by a rate of interest which is higher than the initial rate of interest, but it is lower than what it could be under the fixed exchange rate regime. So before the currency appreciation, the interest rate rises to R1, so that capital will be flowing into the domestic economy. But as then the currency appreciates, then the interest rate will be falling, so that the initial inflow of capital may not be maintained, but still there will be some inflow because R0 is less than R2. Moreover, so far as the level of income is concerned, the expansionary fiscal policy will expand the level of income from Y0 to Y1 under the fixed exchange rate regime, but in the flexible exchange rate regime there will be some appreciation of the currency. Therefore, the initial gain will be eroded partially, so that the income will be falling to some extent and the final increase will be only up to Y2. So, under the flexible exchange rate system and with imperfect capital mobility, the fiscal policy is, when it is expansionary, is effective, but of course its effectiveness will be less than what it could be under the fixed exchange rate regime. Let us now consider the effect of an expansionary monetary policy under perfect capital mobility and fixed exchange rate. Since the perfect capital mobility is there, the BP curve will be horizontal at the rate of interest R0, which is equal to the foreign rate of interest RF also. The IS curves and the LM curves are intersecting each other at point E, so that at point E we are having both internal and the external balance. Now starting from this, let us assume that the government of the country adopts an expansionary monetary policy which shifts the LM curve from LM0 to LM1. IS curve now intersects the new LM curve LM1 at point M. So the rate of interest now becomes R1, so which is less than the world rate of interest RF. So there will be a massive capital outflow from the domestic economy. Now since point M lies below the BP curve, so that there is a deficit in the balance of payment. Now the government will have to intervene in this context because the exchange rate cannot rise in response to the deficit in the balance of trade. But what should be the appropriate type of intervention on behalf of the government? Now, since there is a massive outflow of capital, the investors will be selling the assets denominated in terms of the domestic currency, and therefore they will be selling the domestic currency in the market. The government will have to then sell foreign reserve assets, for example foreign currencies, SDR or gold. Then it will be buying that additional unit of money that is in circulation. So this will be having a direct effect on the money supply of the domestic country, so that the money supply in circulation will be falling, and so that the LM curve will be shifting back towards LM0 from LM1. The government now has increased their holding of the domestic currency, and the common people has reduced theirs by that amount exactly. As the LM curve shifts back to LM0, then the capital outflow from the domestic economy will stop, because now the two rates of interest are equalized once again. But the interesting point is that once again the income will be coming back to its initial level Y0, so that the expansionary monetary policy will be having no impact under perfect capital mobility with the fixed exchange rate system. So this gives a very important result, which states that if a country wants to have a fixed exchange rate regime, and if it wants to make the capital mobility perfect, then it cannot have the expansionary monetary policy to be effective. So that with perfect capital mobility and the fixed exchange rate, the government must give up the monetary policy as a proper effective instrument. So this is called the impossible trinity. It is very difficult to maintain these three things simultaneously: perfect capital mobility, fixed exchange rate, as well as the expansionary monetary policy. The situation is not like that if we consider the expansionary fiscal policy under perfect capital mobility and fixed exchange rate regime. Initial equilibrium is attained at point E, where the level of income is Y0 and the rates of interest are R0 and RF, which are actually equal to each other. Now we suppose that the government takes up an expansionary fiscal policy. So IS curve will be shifting from IS0 to IS1, so that it is cutting the LM0 curve at point N. So immediately the domestic rate of interest will be higher than the world rate of interest. So there will be a massive capital inflow now. Moreover, at point N there is a surplus in the balance of payments. Now, as there is a massive capital inflow and there is a surplus in the balance of trade, the government must intervene, because in the fixed exchange rate, the exchange rate cannot change. Now, government's policy or intervention would now be different. So now the government will try to buy the foreign currency by giving up the domestic currency. So this will increase the amount of money in circulation, so that the supply of money will increase and the LM curve will be shifting from LM0 to LM1. Now this situation will continue until and unless R0 is once again equalized to RF, because then the capital inflow will stop and the external balance will also be maintained. Therefore, the original equilibrium is at E and the final equilibrium is not point N, rather it is point M. So that we are once again back to the internal and the external balance. But here the expansionary fiscal policy is more than effective, because it is increasing the income from Y0 to Y1. So it is in sharp contrast with the effect of expansionary monetary policy, which was not at all effective under perfect capital mobility and fixed exchange rate. The effectiveness of fiscal policy further lies in the fact that the rate of interest is not rising here, so that there is no crowding out of the private investment, so that the impact on the level of income will be the maximum possible. The situation, however, is different under the flexible exchange rate system. First, we consider the effect of an expansionary monetary policy under perfect capital mobility and flexible exchange rate. The initial equilibrium is attained at point E, where IS0, LM0 and the horizontal BP schedule are cutting with the level of income Y0 and the rate of interest R0, which is equal to the world rate of interest RF. Now suppose the government takes up an expansionary monetary policy which shifts the LM curve from LM0 to LM1. The LM1 cuts the initial IS0 at the level of interest rate R1. So R1 is less than R0 or RF. Therefore, there will be a massive capital outflow of the domestic economy. So the individual investors will try to sell off the assets denominated in terms of the domestic currency, and they will be selling off the domestic currency itself. Now at this point, of course, there is a deficit in the balance of payment. Now since it's a flexible exchange rate system, after the deficit, the exchange rate will respond automatically, so it will rise, and then there will be some improvement in the exports and reduction in the import. As the exchange rate rises, then the IS curve will also be shifting towards right. So it will shift until and unless the new IS curve and the new LM curve intersect each other on the original BP curve, so that the new equilibrium is attained at point M. Now, so long as there is a deficit and the exchange rate depreciates, the capital outflow will continue. But once the economy reaches the point M, then the deficit will be eliminated. The country is once again back to external as well as internal balance, so that R0 is once again RF, and the capital outflow will be stopped. So in this case, the monetary policy is highly effective because it increases the level of income from Y0 to Y1. The rate of interest is not rising here, or rather it is not changing, so that the entire adjustment mechanism falls on the exchange rate changes. The fiscal policy, however, is not at all effective under perfect capital mobility and flexible exchange rate. Let us assume that E is the initial level of equilibrium and the government adopts an expansionary fiscal policy. The IS curve shifts from IS0 to IS1, so that IS1 cuts the original LM at point M. Now, to start with, R1 is above the world rate of interest RF, so that there will be a massive capital inflow in the economy. So point M is also lying above the BP curve, so that there is a surplus in the balance of trade. Under the flexible exchange rate system, following this surplus, there will be an appreciation of the domestic currency, so that the exports will fall and imports will rise, and ultimately the BOP equilibrium will be restored. As the exchange rate falls, then the IS curve will be shifting towards left, and ultimately it will come back to its initial position IS0, so that we shall be once again reaching the point E as the equilibrium point, where once again we have the internal and the external balance, and the rate of interest will fall back to its initial level R0, so that all the surplus in the balance of trade will be eliminated and there will be no capital inflow into the system. However, the income level has once again come back to its initial level Y0. So this shows that under perfect capital mobility and the flexible exchange rate, the expansionary fiscal policy is completely ineffective. So that is how we can show the effectiveness of different policies under different exchange rate regimes and with different types of capital mobility in the Mundell-Fleming model. It is often stated that there is an optimal policy mix that a government should follow while trying to achieve external and internal balance simultaneously. The government should rely on the fiscal policy in order to attain the internal balance, and it should use the monetary policy to achieve the external balance. This sort of policy mix must be evaluated for its effectiveness, and we should find out the problems created by this optimum policy mix. We shall be showing this using a diagram where we shall be introducing two separate lines once again. So one line for the internal balance and the other line for the external balance. The only difference with the earlier exercise is that now on the horizontal and the vertical axis we shall be measuring the elements of the fiscal policy and the monetary policy. So let us now introduce two lines. One is called the IB line and the other is called the EB line. So in this diagram, on the horizontal axis, we shall be measuring the fiscal policy parameter. Usually it is the government expenditure. And on the vertical axis, we shall be showing the monetary policy parameter or the rate of interest. Any movement along the horizontal axis towards right will imply an expansionary fiscal policy, and any movement along the horizontal axis towards left will imply a contractionary fiscal policy. Similarly, moving up along the vertical axis will imply a tight monetary policy, whereas moving down along the vertical axis will imply an easy monetary policy. Now the IB schedule shows the combinations of fiscal and monetary policy such that the country attains its internal balance. This IB curve is positively sloped for obvious reason. Suppose that an expansionary fiscal policy is taken, then the level of income will rise in the economy. So to maintain the internal balance, the government will have to take some tight monetary policy so that it should move upward along the vertical axis. For all points to the right of the IB schedule, there will be inflation. Now, we may consider the point A and point B in the diagram. So point A is on the IB schedule so that we have the internal balance there. But at point B, the rate of interest is same as what it is at point A, but the level of government expenditure or the fiscal policy relatively is more expansionary, so that at point B there will be excess demand for the commodity, so that there will be some inflation, or very specifically there will be demand pull inflation. Similarly, at any point to the left of point A, then the fiscal policy will be relatively more contractionary for a given level of monetary policy. So, the level of aggregate demand will be less than what it should be. So, there will be unemployment. Similarly, we have the EB schedule, which shows the combinations of fiscal and the monetary policies such that the country attains the external balance. This curve is also positively sloped for obvious reason. Now, if the fiscal policy is expansionary, for example, if the government increases the level of expenditure, then the level of income will rise in the economy, so that its import will also increase and the nation's trade balance will worsen. So, in order to restore the external balance, then the government will be taking some tight monetary policy which will increase the nation's interest rate. So if the interest rate is increased sufficiently, then there will be capital inflows or the capital outflows will be reduced, so that ultimately the country will come back to the external balance. This actually explains the positive slope of the EB schedule. For all points below the EB schedule, we have a deficit in the balance of payment. Once again, we may compare the point A and the point B. Point A is on the EB curve, so that we have the external balance there. Now at point B, the rate of interest or the monetary policy is same as what it is in point A. But however, at point B, the fiscal policy is more expansionary, so that there will be higher income, higher imports for a given level of export, so that there will be a deficit in the balance of trade of the country. So following the reverse logic, all the points lying above the EB line will be characterized by a surplus in the balance of trade. In this diagram, the EB line is flatter than the IB line. Now, this is true when the short-term capital flows are sensitive to the interest rate differential between the home country and the foreign country. If the government takes up some expansionary fiscal policy, then the income of the country will increase. This will increase the transactions demand for money in the nation. Now, for the given money supply, there will be a mismatch. Now, if the monetary authority decides to increase the money supply sufficiently, then the interest rate will remain unchanged. So, in this case, the expansionary fiscal policy is affecting the national income, but it is not affecting the interest rate. Now consider another case when the government takes up a monetary policy. The monetary policy means that the government will be changing the money supply and the nation's interest rate. When the nation's interest rate is affected, then investment will be affected, and there is the investment multiplier operating, so that the income will also be affected. But as the rate of interest is being affected, so that there will be some change in the capital flows. So if the rate of interest is higher in the domestic country after the monetary policy intervention, then capital will flow in, and if the rate of interest is below the world rate of interest, then money will then capital will flow out. So as a result, monetary policy is more effective than the fiscal policy in achieving the external balance. So that explains why the EB curve will be flatter than the IB curve. Now with this, we come to the principle of effective market classification, which states that the fiscal policy should be used to attain the internal balance, whereas the monetary policy should be used to achieve the external balance. And it is stated that if any country or if any government does the opposite, then it will not be possible for the country to attain the internal and the external balances. This may be shown with an example in the diagram. Given the EB and the IB schedule, we can have 4 zones. Zone 1 gives us unemployment and surplus. Zone 2 gives us inflation and surplus. Zone 3 gives us inflation and deficit, whereas Zone 4 gives us unemployment and deficit. Suppose we start from Zone 4, so that we are somewhere lying in between point N and point Q, so that the country is starting from a point which is lying on the line segment NQ. Now suppose that the country takes up a fiscal policy to attain external balance. Therefore, starting from any point lying in the line segment NQ, it takes up a contractionary fiscal policy so that it can hit the EB line at point N. Now it can follow an easy monetary policy in order to attain the internal balance. But in this case, it would be difficult for the, if not impossible, for the country to come back to point A, which gives us the internal and the external balances simultaneously. But to start with, if the government takes an expansionary fiscal policy to hit the IB line first at point Q and then takes up a tight monetary policy to attain the external balance, then it will move closer and closer to point A. So if we follow this diagram, then we get the principle of effective market classification. Now here everything will be dependent on the responsiveness of international short-term capital flow to the interest rate differential. Now if the short-term capital flows are very sensitive to the interest rate differential, then the EB line will be flatter and flatter compared to the IB line. And in the other case, when the short-term capital flows are not responsive to interest rate differential, then the EB line will be having the same slope as the IB line, so that in that case the principle of effective market classification will not work, so that the country will not gain anything if it could separate the monetary policy from the fiscal policy. This, however, faces certain criticism, specifically under the fixed exchange rate regime. Now, one of these criticism is that the capital flows may not in reality respond to the interest rate differential. So in that case, their responses may be irregular, erratic, so that the desired effect may not be there. Moreover, if the country uses the monetary policy in order to solve the balance of payment problem, then it is basically a short-run solution. In the long run, the exchange rate will have to change, so that under the fixed exchange rate, such type of effective market classification may not be always operating. Moreover, the government and the monetary authorities may be unaware, or they may not know exactly the effects of the fiscal and monetary policies. Often the policies work with certain lags, so that use of monetary and fiscal policy may not give the desired results instantaneously. Moreover, here we are assuming that the prices will remain constant until the full employment level of output and income is reached. But in reality, the prices will rise well before the full employment is reached. In fact, they will rise faster as the economy approaches the full employment level. Therefore, the economists often point out that if this is the case, then the government will be having three objectives, or three targets rather: the internal balance, the external balance, as well as the price stability. So in order to attain these three objectives simultaneously or parallelly, then the monetary and fiscal policy mix should be different than what it is suggested in the principle of effective market classification. For example, the government may use fiscal policy to attain the internal balance, and then exchange rate policies, that is devaluation or revaluation, to attain the external balance, as well as it can use the monetary policy to control the inflation. Moreover, there is a fourth objective of any nation, which is the economic growth. Each and every country should maintain some stipulated growth rate, so which requires the interest rate to be lower in the longer term. Therefore, the countries may often try to keep the interest rate, or the long-term interest rate specifically, lower in the economy. The government then will have to take certain initiatives and objectives in order to keep this interest rate lower, so that the objective of achieving a fixed rate of growth is attained. Thus, in real world, the actual policy makes or the policies taken by the government may be different from those that is discussed under the principle of effective policy mix.